economic. I'm going to be talking about an underdeveloped subject, economic philosophy, and of course its relationship to politics and political thought. But it really is underdeveloped, both in scholarly writing on it, and I think historians' treatment of it as well. But it's very important for obvious reasons. And in that domain as well, there was very significant change that took place in reform thought in the period that I've been discussing in this series of talks. The Age of Catastrophe, as I called it. That title is not original for me. It's a number of historians have used that characterization. And I think it's a very good way of getting our minds around what a dark time this was. What a dark time this was. Human beings live through happy times and they live through times that are very difficult. This was, the more I've read about it, the more I've thought about it, the more I've been struck by how extraordinarily difficult it was for many, many people. Now, the setting for this particular set of remarks is the Great Depression. And I think it's worth pondering right at the beginning what was great about it. Certainly not its consequences in the sense of beneficial consequences. Its consequences were terrible. But it was great, and it was perceived to be great among people who understood that capitalist economies, that is, market economies, go through ups and downs. They grow. There's a kind of cycle they go through that seems to be endlessly the case. It's theorists of market economies recognize this. One of my favorites is a man who says living in a market economy is like being on a roller coaster, up and down, up and down. We sometimes forget this when we enjoy stability in market economies, but especially in the 19th century, there were ups and downs. And of course, the Great Depression was a real downer. One of the most profound downward dips in the history of market economies. It was great, first of all, because of its duration. I think we need to remember that it lasted at least for 2 decades in various forms. At least 2 decades. Starts in 1929. It's not over in 1939. It's arguably over by the end of the Second World War, but I think only arguably because the effects were still being felt. It took another way to put this is to say a deep hole was dug, and it took a long time to climb out of that hole. And there was a lot of some almost desperate improvisation to try to get out of that hole. And I think historians generally recognize, economic historians in particular, recognize that it actually took the mobilization of the war to really enable the various countries, including our own, to finally get out of it. So one thing is duration. A lot of times we think of these downward dips in market economies as relatively short things, relatively modest things. Our name for it is recession, but down and up, down and up. This case was down, 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 and then eventually slowly up. So duration was an important part. I would date it as 1929 to 1945, and that's a conservative estimate. It could be a longer period. Secondly, it was truly the first great global depression. There had been depressions before, but this one was global. It touched people in virtually every corner of the world, and it affected their livelihoods in very difficult ways. A third thing about it that I think is worth emphasizing is that it was comprehensive. That is, it covered all aspects of economic life. Oftentimes, there are downward turns in particular segments of the economy. The agricultural economy, or part of the agricultural economy, is hit. In this case, it hit virtually every corner of economic life, and that too made it great. Another thing that made it great was that this was arguably the first depression in countries that were close to fully industrialized. This was a depression which had at its epicenter, it emanated out, but its epicenter was industrial societies that had been successful in industrializing. Keep in mind, it's very important to not to forget this, that as late as the 1940s, the United States was still in process of becoming an industrial society. There was an enormous percentage of the workforce that were on the farms. That's a kind of we lose that easily lose the memory of that. Um, but in industrial societies, these ups and downs of market economies tend to be experienced differently from ones that are more agricultural. Why do I say that? Because in agricultural economies, people, and I'm talking above all about agricultural economies that are populated by peasants, the peasants can fall back upon subsistence economies on the land. Well, if your workforce is increasingly urbanized, they're working in factories, then it's a different matter. They don't have a farm to go back to. It's very difficult to imagine them engaging in subsistence economics in this way. And of course, what that produces is desperate poverty, desperate poverty among people who don't have a farm on which to rely. And then finally, it was great because of its transformative effects. This was a depression, and this is the theme I'm going to be talking about here today. This was a depression that had truly transformative effects, especially in the realm of economics and more broadly political economy. Uh, and the reason for that was that it brought very dramatically into focus a crisis of the inherited economic ideas. Let me say that again, a crisis of the inherited economic ideas, by which I mean the kind of ideas that were associated at the time with the idea of liberalism, that is liberal economics, laissez-faire, that whole idea of free markets and achieving prosperity through free markets. That had been developed, of course, as the mantra of the great political economists of the previous couple of centuries. Adam Smith, Ricardo, James Mill, all of those people were free marketeers, and they were proponents against other economic ideas, mercantile ideas, and so forth. They were proponents of free markets as the way to achieve prosperity. Keep in mind that Adam Smith's famous work is The Wealth of Nations, The Wealth of Nations. It's almost a recipe for globalization on market terms. Now, that was thrown into crisis. Those ideas, which were, you might say, reigning ideas, especially in the aftermath of the First World War, the desire to return to normalcy, those ideas were ascendant ideas. They were dominant ideas, or at least close to dominant ideas, and the people who articulated them in both the political sector and the economic sector certainly understood them that way. This was the truth about economic life, the truth about economic life. Well, those ideas were thrown into crisis for obvious reasons. And they were challenged by at least two major alternatives. And these were alternatives which were built on the radical idea that what was necessary to move beyond this terrible thing that had been inflicted upon the world by market economies was to have a change root and branch in economic life, to change economic life fundamentally at its core. There was an argument made by people on the left, of course, socialists, who had long been proposing that. Their key idea, going all the way back to Karl Marx and before, was that the way to have a rational economic order, let me stress that, a rational economic order, not a chaotic one, but a rational economic order, was to have what they called collective ownership of the means of production. Collective ownership of the means of production. The means of production, of course, are everything from farms to steel mills, but all the things which produce the basic goods and services should be collectivized and managed through a planned economy. Another name for that, of course, is state ownership of the means of production. And in this period, I want to stress, those ideas have a different we think of them differently today, but those ideas had enormous popularity. So much that as Russia began to mobilize that country to industrialize, many people from the West went over and looked at that and said, "This is our future. This is our future. We'll do it better. We'll do it in a way which is less more humane, less statist, if you will. But we will do it, and that's because it's rational. It's better than this laissez-faire thing. And then, of course, there was a right-wing alternative. Again, we I think are just don't have much memory of that, but fascism represented another economic theory. And it's what I would characterize as a managed capitalism, managed for the purpose of promoting, above all, national goals. It was a kind of nationalistic capitalism. National goals, including, especially in the German case, national goals that included aggrandizing the power of the nation vis-a-vis other nations. And that tended to involve a kind of building up the nation's resource at the expense of other people's. It was nationalistic in that sense. I want to stress that both of those had their successes in the 1930s, in particular in the Great Depression. That's what made this debate very, very intense because there was no question that Russia was undergoing a very rapid industrialization, a very rapid industrialization. And to people who thought industrialization was the wave of the future around the world, this was very impressive. This was very impressive. Now, it was done at the point of a gun. Peasants suffered mightily. They were coerced to give up their farms and so forth and to move into collective farms. But at the time, it looked to many people very impressive. And then on the fascist side, Hitler came to power saying, among other things, I'm going to solve the problem of unemployment. I'm going to solve this problem of unemployment. I'm going to put people back to work. We're going to get beyond this crisis of unemployment that has inflicted our societies. And to a large extent, he succeeded. So there was a period in which you could say that's succeeding where the capitalist economies are not. That's succeeding because it's putting people in mainly in state-run or state-managed industries back to work. The debate therefore turned on this simple distinction. It's not really much of a exaggeration to say it turned on a opposition between the defenders of the status quo. The defenders of the status quo who were put in the position of saying, in the face of this growing unemployment, bank failures, and on, all the things that just shocked people as they experienced it. Essentially, we should do nothing. That was Herbert Hoover's position. That was also the position of the famous, because he became famous later, Friedrich von Hayek. Hayek becomes a major figure in political economy in the Reagan era. Well, Hayek was sort of made his name in this period. He was the great theoretician of what later became neoliberalism. Both Herbert Hoover and Hayek, who was a much younger man at the time, of course, said we should respond to this as we always should respond to downturns in market economies, and that is let the market do its thing. Let things just evolve, and over time we will come out of this with a flourishing economy. We don't need to do anything. As a matter of fact, when we do take steps, when we intervene in the market, we are prolonging the suffering. Over against that were these people who said, no, 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 do nothing. Give me a break. We need to do a lot of things. We need to do radical things and come out with a very different kind of economy. I can't exaggerate the extent to which, in the period of the 1930s in particular, there were fierce debates throughout the Western world over these issues. And fierce debates which were accompanied by a lot of internal conflict, labor unions and other groups forcing the issue. There were, needless to say, fistfights and worse kind of fights in the streets over precisely these matters. The outcome, again, we all know because we've seen it, we've lived the outcome, not so much lived through it, but seen the outcome. The outcome, of course, was a significant change in political economy in the West. Let me say that again. There was a significant change that came about as a result of the Depression. When I said transformative effects, this is what I'm talking about. The movement away from laissez-faire was dramatic in the post-war era, in the direction of what? And this, of course, becomes a very important part of even current debates about what exactly it was. I would use the term, which is most common among scholars on this, some version of the mixed economy. What emerged was a mixed economy, and that's the way it was understood at the time. A mix of, well, not so much fascist, but socialist and capitalist ideas. Social, we'll have a blend of the two, and the argument is but by blending the two, we'll end up with the best of both worlds: capitalist dynamism and socialist recognition of the need to control and limit and manage that dynamism. The proponents of the, shall we say, managed economy, and I'll just mention the foremost one because he really was a huge figure in this period, Keynes. Keynes was might say, the architect of what became the mixed economy. And his very clearly stated goals were the following. He said, market economies inevitably involve this up and down, this what I earlier referred to as a roller coaster effect. But if we allow market economies to have full reign in this, we'll have more and more of these really deep crises, these deep downturns. So what we need to do is manage economic life in such a way as to minimize the swings, to avoid kind of dramatic swings in the character of the economy. And he predicted, with some justification, that with management, you can avoid depressions and limit the downturns to recessions. Let me say that again. You can avoid depressions and limit the downturns to recessions, which, of course, would be a huge gain. So create, in that sense, a more stable economic life, and a more stable economic life, which translated, again, his proposal was, into greater economic security for the average person. Economic security for the average person. If you have severe downturns, you lose your job, you lose everything. Whereas if things are managed, Keynes said, then you can be in a situation where the average person can, with reasonable confidence, face the future with a sense that things are going to be reasonably okay. There will be downturns, but there will be reasonable. And then, of course, the other theme, which was less emphasized by him, but more by socialist leaning, he was a liberal, socialist leaning figures, was we can establish a set of economic arrangements in which there are more equitable outcomes. There are more equitable outcomes. He, again, even predicted, I think correctly, that the result of these policies would be a society which was predominantly middle class, which in the time of the Great Depression was a kind of sort of startling proposal. Instead of having masses of relatively poor people, you could move the majority into the middle class. Now, these are all industrial ideas, not post-industrial. That comes later. But in the era of industrialization, he thought an industrial economy, a flourishing industrial economy, could produce that kind of result. So by the end of the Second World War, those ideas came into popularity and became the basis on which the post-war reconstruction took place. Let me stress it. Those are the ideas on which the post-war economic reconstruction took place. And therefore, people experiencing that could look back and say, well, we've gone through this terrible thing, the Depression, but we've come out on the other end with some wisdom. We've come out on the other end with a recognition that you might say unregulated capitalism is a dangerous thing. And by the way, there was also in this period an insistence on the part of the defenders of the market economies that there was an equal and opposite danger in socialism, which was statism. That is, everything being controlled by the state, which they saw as problematic. You can have a modest expansion of state powers, but not the magnitude of expansion that socialism would entail. Pause. Now I want to talk about the reformed response. I hope I can do it in 20 minutes. This is a complicated story, but I think you'll find it interesting, maybe even fascinating. In order to tell this story, the reformed response, I've got to do a little filling in of background. And here I'm going over a couple of chapters, if you will, in the unfolding of Reformed Protestantism that I've discussed before at Bradley Hills, but I'm under no illusions that you remembered what I said before. So, so here goes a rerun of a movie you've already seen in a compressed form. One of the most famous books in the discussion of the founding of the modern world that's ever been produced, some of you have read it, is a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. You people are readers, and if you haven't read that before, it's not an easy book, but it's not a long book. You might want to read that book. The author is, of course, the famous, truly famous sociologist. He was actually an economic historian at the time, named Max Weber. Weber, not Weber, but Weber, Max Weber, who wrote this book in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, as a kind of historiographic account of the origins of capitalism. And of course, the Protestant ethic signals what? The signals that the Protestantism had something to do with the emergence of modern market economies. And it wasn't just Protestants. The whole book is about Reformed Protestants, particularly what he calls Calvinists. It was really Calvinists, he says, who had this unusually important role in the shape of modern market economies. Now, his basis for that was pretty solid, in my opinion. It was partly just an empirical fact that when you looked around at the countries that took the lead, the Netherlands, Scotland, the UK, to some extent, parts of Germany, these were countries, these almost without exception, he said, were places in which Reformed Protestants were the dominant religious force, and the people who were dominant in the business world, in the banking world, were almost all Reformed Protestants. It was an empirical fact. That was the jumping off place. And he said, how can that be? And he went back and looked at the writings of Calvin and others and recognized something which, for some reason, for some people was a startling fact, but it's true. Calvin, in contrast to the Roman Catholics, in contrast to the Lutherans as well, had certain ideas which seemed to be receptive, led in the direction of market economies. Ideas which were controversial, very controversial at the time, a break with established thinking about the relationship between religion and economic life. What were those ideas? Well, for one thing, in his discussion of callings, John Calvin acknowledged the business person as a business, the world of business as a legitimate calling. Why is that startling? Because the Roman Catholics refused to acknowledge it. They looked upon commerce historically as the work of the devil and a dangerous thing. Calvin had a different view about this, and therefore you might say sanctified the activity of all the members of the Chamber of Commerce. It's okay to be a good, devout Christian and at the same time be devoted to making a little money. He also, very important, actually in economic theory, Calvin introduced the idea that it was okay to take interest on loans. Roman Catholics had questioned that for a long time because they thought it was a kind of violation of the demand in the New Testament that you give freely of what you have to those who are in need. Well, needless to say, economic life is more complicated than just acts of charity. There is such a thing as having capital that you might lend to somebody for the purpose of him making some money. Calvin said there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing implicit in that kind of transaction that is contrary to our faith. And then, of course, there was the whole business of the Protestant ethic, which is not just about work. It's about a whole set of economic attitudes. Work hard, make money, but save your money. Don't use it wastefully. Be very limited in your consumption. Well, of course, what's that? That's a formula for capital formation. If you work very hard and you make money and you save it and then use it productively, that was another one of Calvin's ideas. You're on the way to what? Full-blown capital formation, which was essential to the development of a market economy. Now, for all the reasons I've just named, you can see how there would be a natural inference to draw. Well, that's really just capitalism in the making. It flows right out of Geneva. It's a little more complicated than that, and it's more complicated than Weber recognized, in my judgment. Because the other side of the coin was this: in those early days, Calvin in particular was very worried, was very concerned about the domination of people's lives by mammon. Mammon. Of course, the great biblical idea of wealth taking over people's lives and possessing their lives in such a way that they're indifferent to all other values. And mammon was a threat to righteousness. And so you have this kind of complicated balancing act in Calvin and others who says, yes, we want to have economic activity. We want to encourage that, but be careful, be careful, be careful, because it can get out of hand and it can become a kind of a demonic thing. And that translated in very practical terms, let me just give you one example, to Massachusetts Bay Colony, good Puritan outpost, Calvinist outpost in the New World, Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was a scene of sort of a very good and flourishing economic activity, but always kept under wraps because there were rules in Massachusetts Bay Colony about the way in which you could conduct your economic life. Rules having to do with just wages, just prices, and a whole series of other regulatory measures, if you will, that were designed to avoid the triumph of mammon. I hope you get my point here. A kind of balancing act on the one hand, but on the other. That's the original Reformed idea. Now that's the 1500s and the 16th and the 17th century, the 1500s and the 1600s. By the 1700s, a new thing begins to emerge, and that is what historians sometimes characterize. This is the age when you begin to get the laying of the foundations of a true modern market economy. In that period, you have what historians, I think, appropriately characterize as the emancipation of economic man. Economic man who's been under all these constraints, who's been encouraged, but not too much, in order to balance productivity with righteousness, if you will, godly living. Well, in the next century, the 1700s, the time of the American founding, I hope you see, and later, there begins to be this emancipatory idea about economic man that the good thing is to take the wraps off and let that stream of activity flow. And you begin to get the emergence of market economies, truly market economies. That is, market economies that are not constrained by the regulations that existed in Massachusetts Bay Colony. And you get industrialization. It's the takeoff period, historians characterize it as the period, the latter part of the 1700s and even more the 1800s, the takeoff into a kind of steady pursuit of growth. Growth becomes a kind of catchword for what is desired. And maybe my most important point in this part of my remarks, you get for the first time a separate discipline, a separate kind of inquiry called political economy. Economics as a discipline emerges in the latter part of the 18th century and on into the 19th century. I've given you some of the names with which you're familiar, but let me just repeat them. Adam Smith, David Ricardo, James Mill, all of those people begin to think of themselves as scientists, as scientists analyzing the market as a separate domain of activity. Now, at the center of that whole enterprise of political economy is the idea that the market has its own laws, which at the time were perceived as natural laws, supply and demand. There is a law, there's a connection between supply and demand. And they begin to develop a whole set of normative claims based upon these empirical observations, allegedly empirical observations, which lead to what? A kind of scholarly baptism of the free market, scholarly baptism of the free market. That is, all of these figures and lesser figures as well begin to develop this mantra of let the market flourish on its own terms. And interestingly enough, in this period, And to me, it's just fascinating to discover this. Many leading Reformed Protestant thinkers embraced political economy as gospel, embraced Adam Smith as gospel. To give you an example, it's just a fascinating thing. John Witherspoon, the great John Witherspoon, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, a very, very reformed thinker. Scott, who came to the United States and was president of the College of New Jersey, later to be Princeton, actually wrote some small treatises on political economy. One of his main themes, for example, is the need for sound money, hard money. We don't want to have the government messing around with determining the fate of our money. We want hard money, which of course was a direct appeal to policymakers based upon what Witherspoon understood to be the wisdom of political economy. There was another figure in Scotland who became a very noted political economist himself, who started out as a theologian. Thomas Chalmers wrote a very famous treatise called On Political Economy, and it was just an uncritical embrace of free market thinking. Now, in the light of what I've just said, I hope you understand my conclusion or inference here really quickly, and that is that when the Great Depression came around, the natural instinct on the part of Reformed Protestants, in particular those who were economically literate, in particular those who were economically active, the natural instinct of Reformed Protestants tended to be stick with the market economy. They were, in other words, supportive of the ideas of Hoover, Herbert Hoover, Friedrich Hayek. They were in that camp. Or to put it another way, they were in the camp of saying, doing nothing, just ride it out. The last thing we will want to do is intervene in the market. Now, that's a windup to throw a punch, and here it comes. Karl Barth and others strongly resisted that conclusion. They strongly resisted that conclusion, and we open up, therefore, a whole new chapter, if you will, with Barth and Niebuhr and others, a whole new chapter in the evolution of Reformed Protestant thinking on this topic. Those people were very sensitive. Barth in particular, but Niebuhr as well, Reinhold Niebuhr, were very sensitive to the human toll that the Depression was taking. And they were very, very critical, very skeptical about the notion that the market left to its own devices would solve this problem. They were very impressed also by the socialist idea, largely socialist idea, although they acknowledged Keynes was another resource, that the market economy needed to be regulated at least in order to get out of this mess, and that there needed to be vigorous state action to alleviate the suffering of those who were victims of the Depression. They were strong proponents, in other words. They became strong opponents. They didn't just embrace it initially. Over a period of about 15 years, they moved increasingly, you can just see this in Barth's writings, moved increasingly in the direction of embracing what I've characterized as the mixed economy. By the time the Second World War was over, they were strong proponents of the mixed economy. They didn't want the statist economy that socialism represented. They thought the free market was equally problematic in its own way, and therefore they wanted, in just the way that I described earlier, a kind of mix of socialist and what were known as capitalist elements. But it's interesting to note why they took that position as theologians. What is the theological basis for this? Well, in their minds, it was simple. It was so simple as to be, it was obvious. Like, duh. In their minds, first of all, how can you read, Niebuhr said at one point, how can you read the Old Testament with its very strong emphasis on justice for the poor and so forth? How can you read the Old Testament and not come away with the idea that the civil authorities have some responsibility in controlling outcomes? How can you possibly not get that conclusion? And then they pointed to the fact that in its heyday, the Israeli, the economic life of the ancient Israelites was heavily regulated. It was heavily regulated to keep it in conformity to God's law. God's law, God's intents. That was the Old Testament. And then, equally important, they said, how can you read stories like the Good Samaritan story and not draw the conclusion that Christians have a responsibility to alleviate the suffering of the poor, and more broadly, to produce an economy in which such suffering is, if not avoided, at least minimalized. Barth said at one point, the whole ethos of the New Testament draws you in the direction of taking responsibility for your brothers and sisters in society and making sure that they avoid, not just giving a handout, but making sure that they avoid circumstances in which they're going to be victimized in the way that this depression is that kind of having that kind of effect. So you get in this period a kind of next chapter, if you will, in the unfolding of this actually rather complicated story of the relationship between the Reformed tradition and economic life, and one that clearly represented a critique and to some extent even a repudiation of the legacy of people like Chalmers and John Witherspoon. And by the way, at one point, Barth rather caustically says, there is political economy after the 19th century, after all, and simply to be fixated on those figures as events evolved is a kind of dogmatism that's inappropriate. We've got to respond to the ongoing development of the discipline of economics itself. Now to the conclusion of my remarks. The ideas that these reform thinkers that I've just been discussing, Barth, the Nevers, Emil Brunner would be another one, were very popular in the Western world in the aftermath of the Second World War. People were desperate, after all, to kind of get a clear idea of how to move out of this situation. They were very popular, and they were very popular across the spectrum of political life. And by the way, I'm talking about outside the communist world. Inside the communist world, of course, you had the perpetuation of Marxist, Leninist ideas, very statist ideas. But outside the communist world, which after all is the epicenter of capitalism, especially in the North Atlantic region. Outside the communist world, you had what some historians have characterized as a post-ideological consensus. And they could call it as post-ideological because, for example, in Britain, both the conservatives and the socialists, to a degree, affirmed these ideas. In the United States, some Republicans, many Democrats affirmed these ideas. So there was a kind of middle ground, if you will, consensus politics in the middle ground, not at the outer edges, that embraced this whole idea of a mixed economy. And by the way, it was a widely shared view, not just on political grounds, but religious grounds as well. The mixed economy became a sort of standard theme, not just of Reform thought, but of Lutheran thought, Anglican thought, and Roman Catholic thought. They were all supporting this. And by the way, the Christian democratic parties in Europe in this period come into their, you might say, their own as a powerful force, and they are guided by a kind of Vatican sanctioned embrace of the idea of the mixed economy. Those ideas were very popular. And they turned out to be even more popular over time because you have this extraordinary thing, and it's a term worth reminding ourselves of, a period running from the end of the Second World War through the early 1970s that is now characterized as an economic miracle. An economic miracle. That's actually a term that's used by very sober economists. An economic miracle. Why? Because out of the devastation of that situation, combined devastation of war and depression, out of that devastation, you get, through these policies of progressive taxation, planned economies, and various other things, commitment to minimizing unemployment. Out of that, you get, over time, steadily, 25 years of sustained economic growth. 25 years, uninterrupted. Just steady, 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 steady. So so much a part of people's lives that they came to take it for granted until the 1970s. And then you get that period. We're all in this room, in this on this call, I think probably can remember this, stagflation. Stagflation. When the you might say the economic theory and the political theory that had supported this post-war consensus began to break down. And you have, equally important, a revival of the old way of thinking about the market, symbolized by figures like Ronald Reagan and Maggie Thatcher. What came to be known as neoliberalism was a return to many of those ideas, and a return on the basis that the old ideas in that period of enormous steady economic progress were somehow misguided. There was a sharp critique of those ideas. Too much government spending, too much regulation, etc. Now, what emerged also, and this is a part of that story that you probably haven't heard about before, but now let me emphasize. What also emerged, however, in that period was the following, that there all along had been dissenters to this embrace of the mixed economy in the Christian world. All along, there had been dissenters to this embrace of the mixed economy in the Christian world. And I'm talking about a group of people who have become subsequently extraordinarily important, and that is Protestant evangelicals. Theologically conservative people, Protestant evangelicals, who, on the whole, all along, were very critical of this idea of the mixed economy and the, shall we say, socialist tendencies that were inherent in it. The Protestant evangelicals, uh, especially in that period of crisis for the mixed economies in the 70s and 80s, began to demonstrate, they would say once again, although it really became publicly important only in that period, that they were adamantly opposed to the mixed economy. By the way, Billy Graham had tendencies in this direction, but it was much more Jerry Falwell and his ilk that really brought this embrace of old style market economies back into vogue, which raises a fascinating question. And some of those, of course, Jerry Falwell was not Reformed, he was a Baptist. But it raises a fascinating question. Why would evangelical Protestants be opposed to the mixed economy? I want to give you several reasons, some of which you probably already have in your mind if you've thought about this at all. They were opposed, first of all, to the idea that Christians have a responsibility to take state action, to promote in the state actions that alleviate poverty. Why? Because that was the duty of Christians out of charity. And they saw the expansion of governmental activity and governmental services to alleviate the suffering of the Depression as misguided because it could easily be function as a kind of substitute for good works of charity among Christian people. They have long emphasized charity is what we believe in, not this justice stuff that is emphasized, has been emphasized by the proponents of the mixed economy. Secondly, they saw, and we see echoes of this now, they saw in the growth of state power that the mixed economy undoubtedly represented. They saw in that a potential threat to religious liberty, a potential threat to religious liberty. Keep in mind, of course, that we're already beginning to experience in the 1960s and the 1970s, primarily on grounds of the civil rights activity going on in government, sort of some restraints beginning to impose upon evangelical schools, especially higher education, constraints based upon their unwillingness to embrace the cause of civil rights. Bob Jones University, of course, is the dramatic example of that. So you get this very curious situation, and I will close by just emphasizing that it is curious that segment of the Protestant world and that segment of the Reformed world has rather consistently, and I would say with increasing force and passion in our time, embrace the cause of free markets as though it were the gospel. Embrace the cause of free markets as though it were the gospel. From my point of view, as somebody who's, I would say, in the reformed mainstream, this is just utterly implausible for the reasons I already indicated, the reasons that Bart and others embraced the mixed economy. But it's fascinating to observe not only has it been there all along in the thinking of Protestant evangelicals, and not just in America and other places, sort of aversion to the welfare state, aversion to the regulatory state, aversion to all that kind of governmental activism that's involved in those things. And not only has it been there all along, but now more than ever, it seems to be ascendant. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question for Dr. Douglas. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you.
Good. I thought part of the Protestant work ethic was that if you'd been blessed economically, maybe you had already been blessed by God. God had his or her thumb on the scales. So there was something about being an economic success that suggests that you were more favored by God. I don't know if that was ever popular as I thought it was in Calvin's Geneva, but I wonder if that idea ever has completely died. Is there something about the Protestant work ethic, something about also being one of God's chosen?
Well, that's a great question. 2 or 3 points about it. That was Weber's idea. Weber was the one who said that. He said that's what Calvin taught. He was wrong about that. Calvin was too sophisticated and I would say biblically based a thinker for that to be the conclusion. Mm-hmm. Calvin said, in fact, that there is a correlation between being chosen, being one of the elect, and worldly life only in the sense that those who are called tend to feel a much stronger sense of gratitude for the benefits they get in life, and a much stronger sense as a result of the need to be a righteous person. So that was Calvin's view. It was really this whole idea. And by the way, the thing you referred to is one of the bases of what is now called the prosperity gospel, which in my reading is utterly unreformed, utterly unreformed. So that's part of it. But I have to say one other thing in relation to that. I forgot to mention, but it's very important. You might forgive Weber, who was a secular man, although he had some reformed roots in his background, by being for being confused about this, because Geneva in Calvin's day was a hotbed of economic activity, and a hotbed of very successful economic activity. And the way it worked was, I'm sure you know, in the period of Calvin's lifetime, the size of what we now know as the Canton of Geneva doubled. And it doubled because of all these French refugees and other refugees, but mainly French refugees, streaming out of Geneva, out of France, coming into Geneva and needing to find work. And of course, many of them had very good skills. Some of them were artisans, but many of them were also drawn to business activity. And as a result of their business activity, and this has been repeated around the world, think of the Huguenots spread out. You know, they go to a place and they've got all these skills and entrepreneurial instincts, and they become a little engine of economic dynamism in Geneva. So Geneva becomes much more than it ever had been before, a kind of powerhouse in economic terms. Now, if you're looking at that from a distance, you might say, well, these are people, and some of them did maybe think that their wealth came from being chosen. Calvin would have, I think, clearly resisted that implication. If anything, he scolded the well-off in Geneva for their unwillingness to be even more charitable than they already were. So there was that that sort of flourishing of economic life in Geneva, and it was driven heavily by very righteous, devout people. You could easily see how somebody like Weber would say, "Well, that's the obvious connection. They're well off because, at least in their minds," he would project and say, because God is selected them for this special role. Believe you me, that's a short version of the answer to your question.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Doctor, this may be a little basic, but how have Reformed Protestants dealt and struggled with the parable about a wealthy person going to heaven is like getting a camel through the eye of a needle?
Not well is the answer. But I want to stress more in the later years than at the beginning. Calvin can handle that beautifully. He had this kind of on the one hand, but on the other thing. You know, and literally in the same sermon, you have this encouragement to economic activity, and then in the second part, but be careful, because that can easily be a source of he once said at one point, that can put you in spiritual peril. Now, somebody who's got that mentality is I think reasonably well equipped to answer in an appropriate way the question you've posed. But oftentimes later, and I have to say, clergy were particularly guilty in this regard, looking in this prosperous congregation. Well, you know, sort of in answer to in dealing with a text like that, they would find a zillion ways to get around the point of it, a zillion ways to dance over the main. We've all heard sermons like that. Not specific point, but the pastor somehow is sort of missing the point, perhaps semi-deliberately. But I want to stress, texts like that are easily put in tension, if not contradiction, with the sort of the main themes of Calvin's own teaching. Keep in mind, we're dealing with a tradition here which is 500 years old, with all kinds of different. I mean, for one thing, Calvin did not anticipate in any way that I can see the emergence of these flourishing market economies, let alone industrial economies. That all comes later. So, as in this tradition, like every other one, those who come later have to adapt the ideas, and oftentimes the adaptation was shall we say, a strained one.
Yeah. I've also heard about there's a concept called kingdom building, which is the idea that if someone acquires wealth, they have the obligation to build the kingdom of heaven on earth. And I think it comes out of the 18th or 19th century, but it's an idea that vindicates those who acquire wealth, but also obligates them to use that wealth for the good of others.
Well, let me just concede that there is a coherence to the way of thinking that you just described. There's enough coherence. It's not simple-minded. It's not irrational. I alluded to the logic of it at the end of my remarks, but let me state it again. The idea is Christians have a responsibility to develop their talents. That's true of all of us. To use those talents wisely, to use them productively in ways that benefit the wider society, other human beings. All of that is, I think, something that we could all agree to. Then the move is to say, what is the best way in which to facilitate that growth of, well, let me add one other point. Develop your talents, and if your particular set of talents move in the direction of making money, go for it. Go for it. Next point, go for it. And once you've amassed that money, do two things. Invest it well. Don't just give it away. That's a very reformed move. sort of smart, efficient use of your economic resources, but also charitable works, big charitable works. I was talking recently to somebody who's been in the field of development. That is development in the sense of fundraising for charitable institutions. She said, every time I encounter one of these good old Calvinists, I know I'm in a good territory. Because they have this very strong conviction that they need to use their wealth in charitable ways. So all of that, and by the way, I don't think any of us would take exception to that. But in the evangelical world in particular, and that's really what you're talking about, in the evangelical world in particular, the idea has been, well, what is the source of that wealth? It's the free market. It's that environment in which people can raise this money. So let the market work its magic, if you will, and these fortunes will develop, and these fortunes can then be used for not just outside the economic realm, but in the economic realm, producing jobs and so forth. This wealth can be used in righteous ways. And if we mess that up, if we get involved in all sorts of regulation and control and redistribution, perish the thought, redistribution, then what? Seems to me, at least we are subverting the source of the wealth, and we could even be substituting our action for the action of God. Some even go so far as to say this is really impious because it suggests that we can do what the New Testament taught was the province of ordinary of individual Christians.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your discussion over the last 3 Sundays. It's been really enlightening, and we want to thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Douglas. It gives us a lot of food for thought, and both for our current times and just also where we've come from, especially in the last century and the writings of Bart. As far as next week, I just want to let everyone know that Pastor Gray, David, will be speaking on the Church of the Future. And this is especially in light of our 70th anniversary birthday celebration today. And so we're going to be talking about where we go from here next week. And thank you all for attending today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.